The attorney's voice crackled through Sarah Chen's phone speaker as she stood in the grocery store parking lot, counting the last $17 she had to her name. Her daughter Mia pressed against her leg, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, eyes wide with the kind of hunger that 8-year-olds shouldn't understand so intimately. "Miss Chen, I'm calling about your great-uncle Vincent Moretti's estate. There's a property transfer that requires your signature." Sarah shifted the phone, her other hand instinctively moving to Mia's shoulder. "Vincent Moretti. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today." A name she'd heard maybe twice in her entire life, whispered between her grandmother and mother, in Italian she'd never learned to understand. A man who died alone 3 months ago, leaving behind questions no one had bothered to answer. "I don't understand. I barely knew him. Nevertheless, you're listed as the sole surviving heir to the Moretti silk factory on Industrial Row. The building has been abandoned for 42 years. Mr. Moretti maintained minimal property taxes through an automatic account, but that account is now depleted. You have 30 days to claim the property and assume tax responsibility, or it reverts to the county for demolition." The word demolition hung in the air like a threat. Sarah looked down at Mia, whose school shoes had holes she'd tried to patch with duct tape, at the eviction notice stuffed in her purse, giving them 14 days to vacate the efficiency apartment that smelled like mold and someone else's cigarette smoke. At the courthouse summons for the custody hearing where her ex-husband Marcus would argue that Mia deserved better than a mother who'd lost her nursing job, her savings, and her dignity in the span of 6 brutal months. What are the property taxes? Approximately $4,000 annually. However, the building is structurally unsound, likely contains asbestos, and the neighborhood has been designated for urban renewal. The county has received multiple purchase offers from developers, but Mr. Moretti refused them all. Quite aggressively, from what I understand. $4,000. It might as well have been $4 million. But something in the attorney's carefully neutral tone suggested there was more to this story than an abandoned factory and unpaid taxes. "Can I see it before I decide?" A pause. "Miss Chen, I feel obligated to warn you that 3 previous potential heirs declined the inheritance. The building has a reputation, local folklore, mostly, but the neighborhood children call it the Butterfly House and claim they see lights moving inside at night. Your great-uncle was known as eccentric at best, possibly mentally unstable. He spent his final years obsessed with protecting something inside that building, though no one knew what." Sarah's chest tightened. Obsessed, unstable. The same words Marcus's lawyer would use to describe her if she made any decision that seemed irrational, but she'd learned something in these months of freefall. Rational decisions had gotten her exactly nowhere. Maybe it was time to try something else. "When can I meet you there?" The Moretti silk factory sat on Industrial Row, like a tombstone marking the death of an era. 4 stories of red brick, windows either broken or boarded. The loading dock collapsed in on itself like a mouth missing teeth. Graffiti covered the lower walls, layers of spray paint creating abstract narratives of decay. The chain-link fence surrounding the property leaned at angles that suggested it had given up trying to keep anything in or out. Sarah parked her 15-year-old Honda in front, the engine making sounds that promised imminent and expensive failure. Attorney Richardson waited by the gate, briefcase in hand, his expression suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. "Miss Chen." He extended a hand. She shook briefly. His palm was soft, uncolused, the hand of someone who'd never done physical labor. "This is it. As you can see, the property has been neglected for decades." Mia climbed out of the car, her small hand immediately finding Sarah's. Together, they approached the fence, and Sarah felt her daughter's grip tighten as the building loomed larger. It was massive, easily 50,000 square feet spread across 4 floors, with a loading area that could have accommodated a dozen trucks at once. "Mommy, it's scary," Mia whispered. "It's just old, baby. Old things aren't scary. They're just tired." Richardson produced keys, rust-red and heavy, the kind that belonged to locks made when security meant solid metal instead of electronic codes. The gate groaned open, and they walked across broken asphalt, where weeds pushed through cracks with the determination of life that refused to quit. The front entrance had once been grand. Double doors of carved wood, now weathered gray, with brass handles oxidized to green and black. Above them, barely visible under grime, was carved text, "Moretti Silk Works, Est. 1911, where dreams are woven." Something about those words caught in Sarah's throat. Dreams are woven. What dreams had her great-uncle Vincent been weaving in this decaying monument to industrial collapse? Richardson struggled with the lock, cursing under his breath as decades of rust resisted his efforts. When the door finally opened, the smell that escaped was overwhelming. Mildew and decay, the particular staleness of air that hadn't circulated in years, and something else, something sweet and organic that Sarah couldn't quite identify. They stepped inside, and Mia gasped. The interior opened into a vast space, easily 100 feet across and 40 feet high. Rusted machinery filled the floor like the skeletons of prehistoric animals. Enormous looms, their metal frames still holding rotted remnants of silk threads, spinning wheels the size of cars, processing tanks that once held chemicals now held stagnant water and debris. Light filtered through broken skylights, creating shafts of illumination that made dust dance like snow. The effect was haunting and beautiful in equal measure, a cathedral dedicated to labor that no one remembered. "The main production floor," Richardson's voice echoed in the cavernous space. "This is where they processed raw silk and created fabric." At its peak, Moretti Silk Works employed 300 people. Your great-uncle's grandfather founded it after emigrating from Italy. They supplied luxury textiles to fashion houses in New York, Paris, London. Sarah walked slowly through the space, her footsteps crunching on debris. Mia stayed close, her small hand tight around Sarah's fingers. The machinery told stories in rust and abandonment. Here, women had stood for 12-hour shifts, fingers flying across threads finer than hair. There, men had operated chemical baths that probably poisoned them slowly. This floor had held dreams and exploitation in equal measure, had created beauty through suffering. What happened to it? Synthetic fabrics. Richardson consulted his notes. By the 1970 seconds, polyester and nylon had made natural silk too expensive for most applications. The factory closed in 1982. Vincent Moretti was 28 years old. He'd just inherited it from his father, who'd inherited it from his father. The closure devastated him, from what I understand. He never married, never worked anywhere else. Just became obsessed with protecting this building from developers who wanted the land. They climbed stairs to the second floor, Richardson testing each step before committing his weight. The stairwell was dark, lit only by whatever light penetrated through broken windows. Sarah's eyes adjusted slowly, making out shapes that resolved into more machinery, more abandoned equipment, more evidence of an industry that had died. The second floor held offices, or what had been offices. Desks overturned, filing cabinets with drawers hanging open like tongues. If you find this story engaging, Please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Paperwork scattered and water damaged beyond reading. One room still had a calendar on the wall, frozen at November 1982. The month the factory closed for the final time. Mia pulled away from Sarah, drawn to something in the corner. She reached it before Sarah could intercept, picking up a photograph frame, its glass cracked but intact. The image showed the factory floor in operation, women and men working in synchronized rows, silk moving through their hands like water made solid. "Mommy, look, they made pretty things here." Sarah took the frame, studying faces that had long since aged or died. Her great-uncle might be among them, a young man still believing in futures that would never arrive. The machinery behind them gleamed, clean and purposeful, not yet rusted monuments to obsolescence. "They did, baby. Very pretty things." Richardson was moving toward the back of the second floor, toward a door that seemed more solid than the others. "There's something you should see. Your great-uncle spent most of his time in the executive offices on the fourth floor, but he kept the third floor completely sealed. No one's been up there since the factory closed. Why seal it? That's what we'd all like to know." He told the property inspector 20 years ago that the third floor was structurally unsound, that entering it would be deadly, but building records don't support that assessment. The third floor's structure is identical to the others. They climbed to the third floor landing, and Sarah saw what Richardson meant. The door was sealed, with industrial locks, the kind used on bank vaults, installed decades after the factory's closure. Heavy chains wrapped around the handles, secured with padlocks that looked military-grade. Your great-uncle added these locks in the 1990 seconds. Richardson produced more keys. He was the only person with access. When social services found him dead in his apartment 3 months ago, these were in a safe deposit box with instructions that they should only go to his heir. Sarah's hands trembled as she took the keys. The metal was cold, heavy with implication. "What do you think is up there?" "Honestly, probably nothing. Or possibly hazardous materials he was too cheap to properly dispose of. But we need to inspect it before the county can process the demolition." "Demolition, Miss Chen? Surely you're not considering accepting this property. The tax burden alone would bankrupt you. The building needs hundreds of thousands in repairs just to be safe, probably millions to be useful. The smart decision is to decline the inheritance and let the county tear it down. They'll build something modern and productive. This place is a relic." Sarah looked at Mia, who was staring at the locked door with an expression Sarah recognized. Her daughter wore that same look when reading books about hidden treasures and secret passages, when imagining worlds where adventure waited behind ordinary doors. What if there's something important up there? Something Vincent was protecting? Richardson sighed with the patience of someone explaining obvious truths to the determinedly obtuse. "Then, it's been locked away for 42 years. Whatever it was, it's long since deteriorated or become worthless. Your great-uncle was paranoid and obsessive. Don't let his delusions become yours." But Sarah was already moving toward the door, keys in hand. Mia pressed close, excitement overriding fear. Together they watched as Sarah tried different keys, until one slid home with surprising smoothness, as if the lock had been maintained recently, despite decades of disuse. The chains fell away. Sarah pulled the door open, hinges groaning but functional. Stairs led upward into darkness, so complete it felt solid. "Mommy, the walls are moving." Sarah looked where Mia pointed. In the shaft of light from the landing, something was indeed moving on the stairwell walls. She pulled out her phone, turning on the flashlight, and the movement resolved into something impossible. Butterflies, hundreds of them, clinging to the walls in dense clusters, their wings slowly opening and closing in synchronized rhythm that created the illusion of breathing walls. They were massive, each wingspan easily 6 inches across, their coloring iridescent in ways Sarah had never seen in nature. Blues that shifted to purple, greens that contained flecks of gold, patterns that seemed almost geometric in their precision. "Those aren't native to North America." Richardson's voice had gone quiet with shock. "Those look like morpho species, possibly from South America. But they couldn't survive here. And they certainly couldn't have been living in this building for decades." Sarah took a tentative step upward, and the butterflies nearest her feet took flight, their wings creating a sound like silk fabric being pulled taut. More followed, then dozens, then 100, filling the stairwell with color and movement that felt almost like music made visible. Mia laughed, the sound startling in its purity. She reached up, and a butterfly landed on her palm, wings slowly opening and closing. "It's soft. Mummy, they're so soft." They climbed slowly, butterflies parting before them and closing behind, as if the building itself were alive and welcoming them deeper. The third floor opened into a space that made the lower floors seem mundane by comparison. The entire floor had been converted into something between a laboratory and a sanctuary. Long tables held equipment that Sarah recognized from her nursing training: microscopes, incubators, climate control systems, all connected to generators that hummed softly, powered by solar panels. Sarah could see through skylights that had been carefully maintained while the rest of the building decayed. But the equipment was just framework for the real marvel. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with screens, fine mesh creating chambers of varying sizes. Each chamber held butterflies in different stages, from eggs smaller than pinheads to caterpillars fat and sluggish, from chrysalises hanging like jewels to fully formed adults that moved with lazy confidence through their enclosures. And silk. Everywhere, silk. Not the factory silk from below, but raw silk in its purest form, being spun by caterpillars whose bodies seemed to shimmer with the same iridescence as the adult butterflies. The silk accumulated in layers, creating cocoons that caught light and transformed it into colors Sarah didn't have names for. "My God," Richardson breathed. He was breeding them. All these years, he was maintaining a breeding program. Sarah moved deeper into the space, drawn by something she couldn't articulate. The air felt different here, cleaner, charged with purpose. Equipment hummed with the efficiency of machines, carefully maintained by someone who understood their importance. Charts covered the walls, documenting generations of breeding, tracking characteristics across decades of careful selection. Mia had wandered to the far wall, where the largest chamber held butterflies of a size and coloring that seemed almost unreal. Their wings were easily a foot across, their patterns geometric, precise, colors that shifted depending on the angle of light. They moved slowly, almost regally, and when one landed on the mesh near Mia's face, the child laughed with pure delight. "Mommy, come look. This one has numbers on its wings." Sarah joined her daughter, studying the butterfly Mia indicated. The pattern on its wings did indeed contain what looked like numbers or characters, though whether they were natural or somehow artificial, Sarah couldn't tell. She was still trying to understand when she saw it. Behind the large chamber, almost hidden by the equipment and shadows, was another door. Unlike everything else in this space, it was modern, secured with a keypad that glowed red, indicating it was locked and active, despite the building's apparent abandonment. Richardson had seen it too. He moved toward it with the expression of someone who'd just realized they'd missed something obvious. This wasn't in any of the building plans. This door was added recently, within the last 5 years, based on the technology. "Can we open it?" "Not without the code." And given your great-uncle's paranoia, it could be anything from 6 digits to 16. He pulled out his phone, photographing the keypad. I'll need to bring in a specialist. This might take days. But Mia was already moving past them, her small fingers reaching toward the keypad with the confidence of a child who hadn't learned to doubt herself. She pressed buttons in sequence. 1911. The year the factory was founded. Carved above the main entrance, the keypad beeped. The light turned green. The door clicked open. Richardson stared at the child with something between respect and unease. Sarah felt the same disorientation, as if Mia had tapped into knowledge she shouldn't possess, as if the building itself had whispered its secrets to someone young enough to listen without skepticism. The room beyond was small, maybe 12 feet square, and it was filled floor to ceiling with boxes, archival boxes, the kind used for long-term document storage, each labeled with dates and numbers in handwriting that must have been Vincent's. Sarah opened the nearest one, dated 1985 to 1990, and found it packed with letters, photographs, legal documents, and what looked like scientific journals. She extracted a letter at random, unfolding paper, yellowed with age but still legible. The handwriting was careful, precise, the work of someone who understood the importance of clear communication. Dear Mr. Moretti, thank you for your continued support of our research. The silk samples you've provided have proven invaluable in our work on surgical sutures. The tensile strength and biocompatibility exceed anything we've achieved with synthetic alternatives. I'm pleased to inform you that our patent application has been approved. As agreed, you'll receive 20% of all licensing fees. The letter was signed by a Dr. Patricia Hoffman from Johns Hopkins Medical Research Institute, dated 1989. Sarah rifled through more documents, finding similar letters from institutions around the world: MIT, Cambridge, the Max Planck Institute, Japanese universities whose names she couldn't pronounce. All of them thanking Vincent Moretti for silk samples. All of them reporting breakthroughs in medical, technology, advanced materials, even aerospace applications. All of them promising payment. Richardson was going through another box, his hands shaking slightly as he extracted what looked like patent certificates. Miss Chen, I think you need to see these. The patents were numerous, dated across 4 decades, each one listing Vincent Moretti as primary inventor or co-inventor. Applications ranged from biodegradable surgical sutures to smart textiles to materials for prosthetic devices. Sarah recognized some of the technologies from her nursing work: sutures that dissolved perfectly, nerve-conducting materials used in spinal surgery, scaffolding for growing replacement tissues. These patents, Richardson's voice had gone quiet. Some of these are fundamental to entire industries. If he owned even partial rights, the licensing fees alone would be worth millions annually. They spent the next hour going through boxes, each one revealing more of Vincent Moretti's secret life. The obsessive hermit hadn't been insane. He'd been protecting something genuinely valuable, a breeding program that produced silk with properties that couldn't be replicated synthetically, silk that had revolutionized multiple fields of medicine and materials science. And he'd been hiding it all in this abandoned factory, maintaining the breeding program alone, corresponding with researchers worldwide, while the neighborhood assumed he was just another eccentric, haunting a dead building. Sarah found his journal in a box labeled Personal, and she read it aloud to Mia, Richardson listening with increasing astonishment. The 15th of August, 1982. The factory closed today. 300 people lost their jobs because we can't compete with synthetic fabric that costs 1/10 of what we charge for. Silk. But they don't understand. Real silk isn't just fabric. It's a biomaterial that evolution spent millions of years perfecting. The proteins, the structure, the properties, we've barely scratched the surface of what's possible. I've decided to continue the research alone. My father thinks I'm wasting my inheritance. But he's wrong. The factory isn't dead. It's just changing purpose. Instead of making fabric for dresses, we'll make material for healing. Instead of beauty, we'll create function. And maybe, in the end, that's a better legacy than silk scarves for rich women. The entries continued across decades, documenting Vincent's breeding program as he selected for specific traits: silk with increased tensile strength, improved biocompatibility, enhanced conductivity for medical sensors. He corresponded with scientists, shipping samples, collaborating on research, watching as his work transformed multiple fields while he lived in poverty and obsession. The final entry was dated 2 months before his death. I'm dying. The doctors say 6 months, maybe a year. Cancer, which is ironic given that my silk has helped cancer surgeons save thousands of lives. I've done what I set out to do, turned a dead factory into something that matters, but I'm afraid that developers will tear this building down the moment I'm gone. Afraid that the breeding program will die with me. Afraid that 40 years of work will vanish because no one understands what I've built. I've updated my will, left everything to Sarah Chen, my great-niece, daughter of Maria, granddaughter of Isabella. I barely know her, but Isabella spoke of her with pride before she died, said Sarah was strong, that she'd faced hardship and survived it. That's what this place needs. Not someone rich or educated, but someone strong enough to do impossible things. Sarah, if you're reading this, forgive me for leaving you a burden. The building is worth nothing. The breeding program requires constant attention. The developers will pressure you to sell. But please understand what's at stake. This isn't about money or nostalgia. This is about 40 years of work that has literally saved lives. That will continue saving lives if someone protects it. I've left instructions in the Cocoon room. Follow them. Trust the butterflies. They've been my only companions for decades, and they know things I can't explain. Don't let the building be demolished. Don't let the work end. Please. Sarah closed the journal, her hands trembling. The Cocoon room. That must be behind yet another door, waiting to reveal the final piece of Vincent's legacy. Richardson had gone pale, his earlier certainty, replaced by something approaching awe or fear. Miss Chen, if even a fraction of these documents are accurate, this property isn't worthless. It's potentially worth millions, but verifying all of this will take months, maybe years, and you'd be assuming enormous responsibility for something you don't fully understand. Sarah looked at Mia, who was watching butterflies move through their chambers with an expression of pure wonder. Looked at the equipment, humming with purpose, despite decades of neglect. Looked at boxes filled with evidence that one man's obsession had changed the world in ways no one recognized. She thought about her great-uncle Vincent, dying alone, surrounded by butterflies that had been his life's work and his only family. Thought about the custody hearing in 12 days, where Marcus's lawyer would paint her as unstable and irresponsible. Thought about the eviction notice in her purse and the $17 in her pocket. Thought about Vincent's words, not someone rich or educated, but someone strong enough to do impossible things. I'm accepting the inheritance. All of it. The building, the taxes, the responsibility. Miss Chen, you can't possibly what? Can't possibly be desperate enough to try something insane. Can't possibly believe that an abandoned factory full of butterflies might be worth saving. Sarah's voice rose, surprising herself with its intensity. My great-uncle spent 40 years of his life creating something that mattered. He died, believing I was strong enough to protect it. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe I'll fail, but I'd rather fail trying to do something impossible than succeed at giving up. Richardson studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll draw up the paperwork. You'll need to sign acceptance of inheritance, assume tax liability, and file intent to occupy within 30 days. But Miss Chen, I strongly advise you to consult with experts before making any decisions about the breeding program or the patents. This is complicated territory, legally and scientifically. I'll figure it out. That's what single mothers do. We figure things out. They spent another hour documenting what they'd found, Richardson photographing patents and correspondence, while Sarah made notes of equipment that would need maintenance. Mia explored, unafraid, her small, hands gentle when touching mesh screens or equipment that probably cost more than Sarah's car. As they prepared to leave, Mia paused at the large chamber, holding the butterflies with geometric patterns. "Mommy, can I tell you something?" "Of course, baby." "The butterflies say the Cocoon room is behind the blue machine. They say Uncle Vincent left you treasure there. They say it's safe now, because you came." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. "Butterflies can't talk, honey. I know. But they can show pictures in my head. They're trying to help, because Uncle Vincent asked them to watch for you." Richardson's expression suggested he was reconsidering his opinion about the family's mental stability. But Sarah moved to the blue machine, an industrial incubator, and examined the wall behind it. Found, as Mia had somehow known she would, another door, this one unlocked, opening into a space that took Sarah's breath away. The Cocoon room was perhaps 20 feet square, its walls lined with screens finer than anything they'd seen before. Each screen held silk cocoons in various stages, but these were different from the others, larger, with an iridescence that seemed almost to glow in the dim light. The air smelled sweet, organic, alive, in ways that made Sarah's skin prickle, with awareness that she was witnessing something rare. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it rested a sealed container marked with biohazard symbols and Vincent's handwriting. For Sarah, instructions and foundation. Sarah opened it carefully, finding a USB drive, a letter, and what looked like bank books. She read the letter first, Vincent's handwriting shaky but determined. "Sarah, if you've made it this far, you've decided to accept the burden. I'm leaving you. Thank you. I know it's unfair. I know you have your own struggles. But please understand what you've inherited. The butterflies in this room are the culmination of 40 years of selective breeding. They produce silk with properties that don't exist in nature. Stronger than steel, by weight, biocompatible enough for human implantation, capable of conducting nerve signals better than any synthetic material. I've called it Moretti silk, and it represents the next generation of biomedical materials. The USB drive contains full documentation of the breeding program, genetic sequences, production protocols, and contact information for research partners who've been waiting for approval to begin human trials. The bank books show accounts I've maintained for the licensing fees from previous patents. Last balance approximately $47 million, all of which is now yours. Use the money to maintain the breeding program. Hire experts. Expand the work. I've spent 40 years hiding because I was afraid of exploitation, afraid that corporate interests would steal the butterflies and destroy the breeding lines in pursuit of short-term profit. Maybe I was paranoid, or maybe I was right. Either way, that fear dies with me. You're free to make different choices. Sell the patents if you want. Use the money to build a better life for yourself and your daughter. But if possible, if you have any capacity left after survival, please continue the work. Please make sure that 40 years of solitary labor result in something that helps people. The Cocoon room is sacred space. The butterflies here are third-generation Morphobombix hybrids, impossible in nature, created through techniques I've spent decades perfecting. They're fragile, they require precise temperature and humidity control, but their silk is miracle material that surgeons have been begging me to produce in quantity. I'm leaving you instructions, following them precisely. And forgive an old man for forcing responsibility on someone who never asked for it. I had no one else to trust. Your great-uncle, Vincent Moretti. Sarah set the letter down with trembling hands. $47 million. The number was so large, it seemed abstract, meaningless. She picked up the bank books, flipping through pages of deposits spanning decades, watching the balance grow from thousands to millions as Vincent's patents generated licensing fees he apparently never spent, just accumulated against some future he'd been planning for someone else. Richardson had been reading over her shoulder. When Sarah turned to him, his expression was complicated, shock and calculation, and something approaching respect. Miss Chen, this changes everything. With that capital, you could hire the world's leading experts in lepidopterology and biomaterials science. You could convert this building into a proper research facility. You could turn your great-uncle's obsession into a legitimate enterprise that might genuinely change medicine. Or, I could take the money and run. Let the breeding program die. Let someone else carry the burden. You could. That would be the sensible decision. Sarah looked at Mia, who was watching a butterfly emerge from its cocoon with an expression of wonder that reminded Sarah why she'd become a nurse in the first place. The desire to help, to heal, to be part of something larger than her own survival. Let's say I wanted to continue the work. What would that look like practically? Richardson pulled out his phone, already making notes. First, we secure the building properly. Climate control, security systems, proper laboratory setup. Second, we bring in experts to evaluate the breeding program and ensure it's being maintained correctly. Third, we establish a legal entity to protect the patents and manage licensing. Fourth, we begin the process of scaling production for human trials. How long would all that take? Months at minimum. Possibly years to do it properly. I have 12 days until my custody hearing. Marcus's lawyer is going to argue that I'm unstable, that I can't provide for my daughter. If I show up claiming I've inherited $47 million and a butterfly breeding program that produces miracle silk, they'll think I'm delusional. Richardson considered this, his lawyer's mind working through options. Then we verify immediately. I have a contact at the patent office who can confirm the licensing agreements. I know several venture capital firms that specialize in biomedical technology. They can assess the commercial viability. We document everything, get expert testimony, build a case that you haven't inherited fantasy, but genuine, valuable intellectual property. And if it turns out Vincent was delusional? If the patents are worthless, and the silk is ordinary, then you're in the same position you were this morning, minus whatever you spend on verification. But Miss Chen, I've been practicing law for 27 years. I've seen embellishment and fraud and wishful thinking. This doesn't read that way. Your great-uncle was eccentric, certainly, but his documentation is meticulous. The correspondence is with legitimate institutions. The patents are registered and active. I think he was exactly what he claimed to be. A genius working in isolation because he didn't trust the world with something precious. Sarah walked slowly through the Cocoon room, studying butterflies that represented decades of selective breeding and solitary dedication. She thought about Vincent spending 40 years alone, sacrificing normal life for work he believed mattered. Thought about the nurses and doctors, and, Patients who'd benefited from his innovations without ever knowing his name. Thought about legacy and burden and the strange alchemy that transformed obsession into value. Okay, let's verify everything. Bring in your experts. But Richardson, I need you to be honest with me. If I'm making a mistake, if I'm letting desperation cloud judgment, tell me now, before I commit to something that destroys what's left of my life. Richardson met her eyes, his expression serious. Miss Chen, I think your great-uncle chose you precisely because you're desperate enough to appreciate what he built. Comfortable people don't take impossible risks. They don't bet everything on abandoned factories and butterfly breeding programs. But sometimes, the impossible risks are the only ones worth taking. They locked the building carefully as they left, Sarah's hands lingering on the doors as if committing their weight and texture to memory. The butterflies inside continued their work, oblivious to human drama, focused on the ancient imperative of transformation. As Sarah drove away, Mia curled in the passenger seat. She looked in the rear-view mirror at the factory receding behind them. From the outside, it still looked like a relic, a monument to industrial death, but she knew now what it contained. Transformation happening in darkness, value accumulating in spaces everyone assumed were empty, life persisting in places designated for demolition. Maybe she was like that building. Maybe desperation and loss had stripped away everything surface level, revealing something more fundamental underneath. Maybe inheritance wasn't about receiving what you wanted, but accepting what you needed to become. Her phone rang as they pulled into the apartment complex parking lot. An unknown number. Sarah answered with the weariness of someone expecting bad news, because that's all she'd received for months. Sarah Chen. The voice was female, professional, carrying an accent Sarah couldn't place. Speaking. My name is Dr. Yuki Tanaka. I'm a research scientist at Osaka Medical University specializing in biomaterials and tissue engineering. Vincent Moretti and I corresponded for 15 years regarding applications of Moretti silk in nerve regeneration. I received notification this morning that Vincent passed away 3 months ago, and that his estate has finally been settled. I understand you're his heir. I am. Miss Chen, I realize this is sudden, but I need to know, do you intend to continue Vincent's breeding program? Because if not, I have funding and facility space to relocate the butterflies to Japan, where we can maintain the work he started. The silk he developed is breakthrough material. We're this close to human trials that could restore function to paralyzed patients. But we need consistent supply of the specific silk variant Vincent was producing. Sarah felt the words like physical weight, paralyzed patients, restored function. 15 years of correspondence with a scientist halfway around the world who saw the same value Vincent had seen. Dr. Tanaka, can I ask you something? Was Vincent crazy? A pause. Then, soft laughter. Sad, but warm. Vincent was brilliant. Difficult, certainly. Paranoid about intellectual property theft, absolutely. But crazy? No. He understood silk in ways that took me years to appreciate. When I first read his papers, I thought he was exaggerating the material properties. Then I tested samples he sent, and I realized he'd been underselling them. The silk his butterflies produce shouldn't be possible according to conventional genetics. But it exists, and it works, and it could change millions of lives if we can scale production. I'm going to continue the program. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to try. Thank you. The relief in Dr. Tanaka's voice was palpable. Vincent spoke of you once, near the end, said he'd found someone strong enough to carry the work forward. I didn't understand then what he meant. I think I'm beginning to. They talked for another 20 minutes. Dr. Tanaka, explaining the research applications. the timeline for human trials, the specifications for silk production that would be needed. Sarah took notes on the back of her eviction notice, filling margins with technical terms she'd need to research later. When they finally ended the call, Sarah sat in the car with Mia still sleeping, watching sunset paint the sky in colors that reminded her of butterfly wings, strong enough to carry the work forward. That's what Vincent had believed. That's what Dr. Tanaka now hoped. Whether they were right remained to be seen. But for the first time in months, Sarah felt something other than fear when contemplating the future. She felt possibility. The next week passed in a blur of expert consultations, patent verification, and legal maneuvering that made Sarah's head spin. Richardson brought in specialists who confirmed what Vincent's documents claimed. The patents were legitimate, the licensing fees real, the research partnerships active. The $47 million existed, accumulating interest in accounts Vincent had established decades ago through a trust designed to protect the funds from interference or seizure. A team from Massachusetts General Hospital arrived to evaluate the breeding program. 3 scientists who spent an entire day examining Vincent's butterflies and procedures. Their leader, Dr. James Morrison, was a lepidopterist who'd published papers on silk production. He examined the cocoon room with an expression of increasing awe, his hands gentle when handling specimens, his questions revealing deep expertise. "This is extraordinary work," he announced after 6 hours of examination. Mr. Moretti created breeding lines that shouldn't exist. The genetic stability alone represents decades of careful selection. And the silk properties, he held up a strand, so fine Sarah could barely see it, letting light catch and transform it into prismatic colors. This material has tensile strength approaching spider silk, biocompatibility exceeding anything synthetic, and conductivity that suggests applications in neural interfaces. If we can scale production, this could revolutionize prosthetics, surgical, reconstruction, even brain-computer interfaces. Can it be scaled? Sarah asked the question that had been haunting her. Or was this only possible because Vincent spent 40 years doing it by hand? Dr. Morrison considered carefully. It will require significant infrastructure investment, climate-controlled facilities, automated monitoring systems, trained staff who understand the precise requirements of these specific breeding lines. But, yes, I believe it's scalable. The question is whether you're willing to commit to that level of investment and oversight. Sarah looked around the cocoon room, at butterflies that represented Vincent's entire adult life, at equipment maintained through obsessive dedication, at work that had continued in secret while the world dismissed the building as worthless ruin. "I'm willing. Tell me what you need." What she needed, it turned out, was everything. Dr. Morrison provided a proposal that included converting the entire 3rd floor into proper laboratory space, installing industrial climate control systems, hiring a staff of at least 5 specialists, and implementing quality control measures that would satisfy FDA requirements for medical-grade materials production. The estimated cost, $8 million for initial setup, plus approximately $2 million annually for ongoing operations. Richardson negotiated with contractors, pushing for aggressive timelines. Sarah signed papers that transferred millions of dollars from Vincent's accounts to fund renovations that seemed impossible in their scope. Within days, construction crews arrived, beginning the transformation of an abandoned factory into a functioning biomedical research facility. The neighborhood watched with confusion bordering on alarm. The building that had been dark and silent for decades suddenly blazed with light and activity. Workers cleared debris, replaced windows, installed equipment that arrived in trucks bearing corporate logos Sarah didn't recognize. Rumors spread. The building had been sold to a pharmaceutical company, to a tech startup, to government researchers conducting classified experiments. Sarah let them speculate. The truth was too complicated to explain to people who saw only surface transformation and missed the deeper continuity. This was what Vincent had been working toward all along, not isolation, but preparation for the moment when someone would finally understand and expand his work. The custody hearing loomed closer. Marcus's lawyer filed new motions, arguing that Sarah's sudden claims of inherited wealth proved she was delusional or engaged in fraud. Richardson countered with documentation, bank statements, patent verification, expert testimony from scientists who'd worked with Vincent for decades. The judge ordered independent evaluation, assigning a court-appointed expert to verify that Sarah's claims weren't elaborate fantasy. The expert, Dr. Hannah Rodriguez, arrived on day 8. She was a biochemist with credentials from Stanford and Yale, her expertise specifically in biomaterials and their medical applications. Sarah showed her everything: the breeding program, Vincent's documentation, the correspondence with researchers worldwide, the patents that had generated $47 million across 4 decades. Dr. Rodriguez spent 6 hours in the factory, examining evidence with the skepticism of someone who'd seen too many overblown claims to accept anything without verification. She took samples of silk, reviewed genetic sequences, interviewed Dr. Morrison and his team. When she finally spoke, her tone was carefully neutral, the voice of someone trying to process impossibility made manifest. "Miss Chen, I came here expecting to debunk what seemed like obvious delusion. Instead, I've found what might be the most significant development in biomedical materials in the last 50 years. Your great-uncle wasn't crazy. He was a genius working in complete isolation because he didn't trust anyone else with his discoveries, and he was probably right not to trust. If the wrong people had gained access to these breeding lines before they were stable, they would have destroyed them, trying to commercialize too quickly. So the silk is real. The applications are legitimate. More than legitimate. Conservative estimates suggest the licensing value of Moretti silk could exceed $500 million within 5 years. Once human trials are complete and FDA approval is obtained, the material properties are genuinely unique, and the medical applications are profound: nerve regeneration, tissue scaffolding, bioelectronic interfaces. All of these fields have been waiting for materials with exactly these properties. Sarah felt her knees weaken. She sat down heavily on equipment. Crate. The number $500 million meaningless because it was too large to process. "And you'll testify to this at the custody hearing?" "I'll testify that you've inherited legitimate and extraordinarily valuable intellectual property, that you're managing it responsibly by bringing in qualified experts, and that your decisions reflect sound judgment rather than delusion or instability. Whether that's enough to satisfy the court regarding custody, I can't predict. But from a scientific standpoint, your claims are not only valid, but potentially understated." The custody hearing took place in the same courtroom where Sarah had signed her divorce papers 8 months earlier. She sat beside Richardson, watching Marcus and his lawyer prepare arguments designed to paint her as unfit. Behind her, filling the gallery, were witnesses Richardson had assembled: Dr. Morrison, Dr. Tanaka via video link from Osaka, Dr. Rodriguez, contractors who'd worked on the factory renovation, even neighbors from Industrial Row who'd watched the building transform. Marcus's lawyer started strong, painting a picture of instability and fantasy. A woman who'd lost her job and home now claimed to have inherited millions from an uncle she'd never met, who believed butterflies could produce miracle materials, who'd moved her daughter into an abandoned factory that should have been condemned. Your Honor, Miss Chen has always been prone to magical thinking and poor judgment. She left nursing school before completing her degree. She made impulsive financial decisions that contributed to the bankruptcy she and my client faced during their marriage. Now, rather than seeking stable employment and housing, she's pursuing fantasies involving silk and butterflies, while her daughter lives in conditions that can only be described as unsafe. Richardson's cross-examination was surgical. Mr. Hayes, you stated that Miss Chen left nursing school. Is it not true that she left to care for her dying mother full-time? Well, yes. And that the impulsive financial decisions you reference were actually medical bills from her mother's cancer treatment that insurance didn't cover. That's simplifying. Is it also true that you filed for divorce 2 weeks after Miss Chen's mother died, leaving her to manage the debt alone? Marcus's face flushed. His lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The narrative of irresponsibility crumbled when examined closely, revealing a woman who'd sacrificed career and financial stability to care for family. Then Richardson called his witnesses. Dr. Morrison testified about the breeding program's legitimacy and value. Dr. Tanaka explained via video how Vincent's silk was enabling research that could restore mobility to paralyzed patients. Dr. Rodriguez presented her findings, including conservative estimates of the property's value and statements about Sarah's competent management of extraordinary circumstances. The factory's transformation was documented in photographs, before shots showing abandonment and decay, after shots showing proper laboratory facilities and equipment installed according to FDA specifications. Contractors testified that Sarah had made all decisions in consultation with experts, that she'd prioritized safety and long-term sustainability over short-term gains. Finally, Richardson called Sarah herself. She testified about the inheritance, about her decision to accept responsibility for Vincent's life work, about the consultation with experts and careful planning that had guided every choice. Miss Chen, the judge asked during questioning, why did you accept this inheritance? You could have declined it, let the county demolish the building, avoided all this responsibility. Sarah thought carefully before answering. Your Honor, my great-uncle Vincent spent 40 years of his life creating something that saves lives. He did it alone because he didn't trust anyone else to protect his work. When he died, he believed I was strong enough to carry it forward. Maybe I'm not, maybe I'll fail, but I'd rather fail trying to do something that matters than succeed at taking the easy path. My daughter deserves to see her mother fight for something beyond just survival. She deserves to learn that impossible things are sometimes worth attempting. The judge studied her for a long moment. And the accusations that you're unstable, that you're pursuing fantasy rather than stability. 6 months ago, I was unstable. I'd lost my job, my home, my mother, my marriage. I was barely surviving, just trying to keep my daughter fed and housed. Then I inherited something impossible, and I had a choice: dismiss it as delusion and stay in the safe zone of managed poverty, or take a risk on something that seemed too good to be true. I chose the risk because I've learned that safe choices don't guarantee safety. Sometimes the only way forward is through impossibility. The judge asked to speak with Mia privately. Sarah waited in the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs, knowing that everything depended on what her 8-year-old daughter said in that room. When Mia emerged 30 minutes later, she was smiling, unafraid, and she walked directly to Sarah with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved. The judge's ruling came 2 hours later, after reviewing all the testimony and documentation Richardson had provided. This court finds that Miss Chen has demonstrated sound judgment in managing extraordinary circumstances. The inheritance she received is legitimate and valuable, verified by multiple expert witnesses with no financial interest in the outcome. Her decision to accept responsibility for continuing her great-uncle's work reflects admirable character rather than instability. Furthermore, this court notes that Mr. Hayes filed for increased custody at a time when his ex-wife was most vulnerable, using her temporary hardship as ammunition rather than offering support. While this is not illegal, it speaks to priorities that this court finds troubling. Primary custody remains with Miss Chen. Visitation for Mr. Hayes continues as previously established. This court encourages both parents to focus on their daughter's well-being rather than using her as proxy in conflicts that should remain between adults. Case closed. The gavel fell, and Sarah felt tears she'd been holding for months finally escape. Mia pressed against her side, small arms wrapping tight, and together they stood in the courtroom that had tried to separate them, victorious not through perfection, but through refusal to surrender. Marcus approached as they were leaving, his expression complicated shame and regret, and something approaching respect. "Sarah, I'm sorry. My lawyer convinced me you were falling apart, that Mia would be better off with me. I should have trusted that you'd figure things out like you always do. You should have helped instead of attacking. That's what co-parents do, Marcus. They support each other through difficult times. I know, and I'll do better going forward. I promise." Sarah nodded. Not quite. Forgiving but willing to accept the intention. They had years of co-parenting ahead, and grudges served no one, especially not Mia. Outside the courthouse, Richardson was already fielding calls from venture capital firms and pharmaceutical companies interested in partnerships. Dr. Morrison had assembled a team ready to begin scaling production. Dr. Tanaka was making plans to visit in person, bringing research collaborators who'd been waiting years for sufficient silk supply to advance their work. The impossible inheritance that should have been burden had become foundation. Vincent's 40 years of solitary work were about to transform into collaborative enterprise that might genuinely change medicine. And Sarah, who 6 months ago had been counting her last $17 in a grocery store parking lot, now stood at the center of transformation she barely understood but was determined to protect. The months that followed were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. The factory renovation was completed, transforming the third floor into a proper research facility that would have made Vincent proud. Dr. Morrison and his team implemented breeding protocols that maintained the genetic integrity Vincent had established while scaling production to meet research demand. Sarah hired staff carefully, prioritizing people who understood that profit mattered less than protecting work that saved lives. She established the Moretti Silk Research Foundation, a non-profit structure designed to ensure that licensing fees funded continued research rather than private enrichment. Yes, she'd become wealthy beyond anything she'd imagined, but wealth felt less important than stewardship. Dr. Tanaka's research team was the first to receive production quantities of Moretti silk. They used it to create nerve scaffolds for patients with spinal cord injuries. Early trials showing results that exceeded any previous intervention. Other researchers followed. Surgeons using the silk for delicate repairs in pediatric cardiac surgery, tissue engineers using it to grow replacement organs, neuroscientists incorporating it into brain-computer interfaces that might one day restore function to stroke victims. Each application validated Vincent's 40 years of solitary work. Each success proved that his paranoia had protected something genuinely valuable from exploitation that would have destroyed it before maturation. Sarah learned to navigate the world of biomedical research and intellectual property law, guided by experts, but making final decisions herself. She discovered she had aptitude for this work, The same skills that made her a good nurse, translated to managing complex projects involving multiple stakeholders and competing priorities. Mia thrived. The factory became her playground and classroom, where she learned biology from watching butterflies transform, learned chemistry from understanding silk protein synthesis, learned business from observing her mother negotiate with researchers and investors. She no longer carried the haunted look of a child living at the edge of homelessness. Instead, she radiated confidence born from watching her mother turn impossibility into achievement. 1 year after accepting the inheritance, Sarah stood in the Cocoon room with Mia, both of them watching a new generation of butterflies emerge. These were third-generation descendants of Vincent's original breeding lines, their silk even more refined, their patterns even more precise. "Mommy," Mia asked, "do you think Uncle Vincent knows we saved his work?" Sarah thought about the question seriously. "I think he knew before he died. That's why he left it to us. He believed we'd be strong enough to do what he couldn't." What couldn't he do? Let other people help. Share the work, instead of protecting it alone. Vincent spent 40 years scared that someone would steal his discoveries or destroy them through carelessness. So he worked in secret, hiding everything, trusting no one. But that meant his work couldn't grow beyond what one person could accomplish. And we made it grow. We let it grow by inviting people who shared Vincent's values but could contribute expertise he didn't have. Dr. Morrison understands butterfly breeding better than Vincent did. Dr. Tanaka understands medical applications Vincent could only theorize about. Together, they're accomplishing more than Vincent ever could, alone. So, Uncle Vincent was right and wrong. Sarah smiled at her daughter's wisdom. Exactly right and wrong. Right to protect the work until it was ready. Wrong to think protection meant isolation forever. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't holding on tighter. It's learning when to open your hands and invite others in. They stood in silence, watching butterflies move through their cycles of transformation. Eggs to caterpillars to cocoons to adults, each stage necessary, each transition carefully nurtured. Sarah thought about her own transformation over the past year, from desperate, single mother to steward of breakthrough technology, from someone barely surviving to someone building legacy that would outlast her lifetime. The factory that should have been demolished was now a beacon, drawing researchers from around the world. The breeding program, Vincent, maintained in secret, was now collaborative enterprise, involving dozens of institutions. The silk that one paranoid genius had protected for 40 years was now saving lives in hospitals across 3 continents. And Sarah, who'd inherited burden she didn't want and couldn't refuse, had discovered that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as impossible responsibilities. That strength isn't about knowing you can succeed, but about trying anyway when success seems impossible. Vincent had left her more than butterflies and patents. He'd left her purpose, meaning, connection to legacy, larger than individual survival. He'd left her proof that one person's dedication could change the world, even if that person died before seeing the full impact of their work. 3 months later, Dr. Tanaka's team published results from their first human trials. 15 patients with complete spinal cord injuries had received nerve scaffolds made from Moretti silk. 12 showed significant improvement in function, with 3 regaining enough motor control to walk short distances with assistance. The results made international news. Vincent's name, unknown for 40 years, suddenly appeared in headlines across the world. The silk that repairs nerves. Butterfly breeding program produces medical miracle. Dead. Inventor's legacy transforms paralysis treatment. Sarah gave interviews carefully. always emphasizing that Vincent deserved credit, that his 40 years of solitary work had made everything possible. She shared stories of his dedication, his paranoia, his ultimate decision to trust a great niece he barely knew with his life's work. And she explained why she'd accepted the inheritance, despite having every reason to walk away. Vincent believed that some things matter more than husband, personal convenience, or financial security. He believed that butterfly silk could change medicine, and he was right. My choice was simple: honor his belief by continuing the work, or let 40 years of dedication be demolished along with the building. I chose to honor him. I chose to believe that impossible things are sometimes worth attempting. And I'm grateful every day that I made that choice, because now his work is helping people he never met, solving problems he only theorized about, creating futures he couldn't imagine, but worked toward anyway. The custody issue never resurfaced. Marcus saw Mia regularly, their co-parenting relationship evolving into something functional, if not warm. He'd moved on with his life, remarried, started a new family. Sarah bore no resentment. They'd both been different people during their marriage, changed by hardships neither fully understood at the time. The factory continued its transformation. The first floor became a museum documenting the history of Moretti Silkworks, from its founding in 1911 through its closure in 1982 to its resurrection as biomedical research facility. Visitors could see the original machinery Vincent's grandfather had installed, could read letters from fashion houses in Paris and New York, could trace the family's journey from Italian immigrants to industrial pioneers. But the heart of the museum was the third floor, where visitors could observe the breeding program through glass walls that protected the butterflies while allowing people to witness transformation happening in real time. Educational displays explained the science, the applications, the 40 years Vincent spent working alone to perfect something nobody else believed was possible. Mia became the museum's unofficial youth ambassador, giving tours to school groups with the confidence of someone who'd grown up surrounded by impossibility made manifest. She explained genetic selection and silk protein synthesis and medical applications with ease that made Sarah proud beyond words. One afternoon, while watching Mia lead a tour, Sarah was approached by an elderly woman who'd been quietly observing from the back. She was perhaps 80, dressed simply, her hands showing the marks of manual labor and arthritis. "You're Vincent's great niece," the woman said. "Not a question. I am. Did you know him? I worked here before the factory closed. 43 years ago this month, I was on the production line, spinning silk for luxury fabric. When the closure was announced, Vincent called us all together. He was so young then, barely 30. He told us he'd failed us, that he should have seen the synthetic fabrics coming, should have diversified, should have saved our jobs. The woman's eyes were wet with tears she didn't hide. We told him it wasn't his fault, that the whole industry was dying, that there was nothing any one person could have done, but he took it personal. I remember his face when we locked the doors that final time, like something inside him had broken. What happened to you after the closure? What happened to all of us? We found other work, worse pay, less satisfaction. I ended up in a plastic factory, made enough to survive, retired with nothing. Watched Industrial Row decay, all those beautiful buildings abandoned. I assumed Vincent had sold this place, moved on. But then I heard he'd been here the whole time, alone, working on something. I didn't believe it until today." The woman gestured at the museum, at the butterflies visible through glass walls, at the displays documenting transformation she'd witnessed firsthand. He didn't give up. He just changed direction. Instead of fabric for dresses, he made material for healing. That's something, isn't it? To lose everything and still find purpose? It's everything, Sarah agreed quietly. The woman squeezed Sarah's hand. Thank you for finishing what he started. Thank you for making sure his 40 years weren't wasted. Those of us who worked here, we always wondered if the factory meant something. Now we know it did. After the woman left, Sarah stood in the museum for a long time, thinking about all the lives that had intersected with this building. The 300 workers who'd made silk fabric until economics destroyed their jobs. Vincent, who'd transformed loss into obsessive purpose. The researchers worldwide who'd collaborated with him while he worked in isolation. The patients whose lives were being changed by materials he'd created. And herself, a desperate single mother who'd inherited impossible responsibility and discovered that burden could become blessing if you were strong enough to carry it with grace. The phone in her pocket buzzed. Dr. Morrison, texting updates about the newest breeding line they were developing. This variant would produce silk optimized for pediatric cardiac surgery, finer and more delicate than anything previously possible. Sarah replied with approval, then pocketed the phone and went to find Mia. They had dinner plans with Dr. Tanaka, who was visiting from Osaka to discuss expansion of the research program. Then, tomorrow, Sarah would meet with architects about converting the second floor into additional laboratory space, and next week, she was scheduled to testify before a Senate committee about funding for biomedical materials research. The schedule was exhausting, the responsibility was enormous, and Sarah wouldn't have traded it for anything. Because Vincent had been right. She was strong enough to inherit impossibility, strong enough to transform burden into purpose, strong enough to prove that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as challenges no sane person would accept. The factory that should have been demolished now saved lives. The butterflies that should have died with Vincent now represented breakthrough technology. And Sarah, who should have been destroyed by loss and hardship, had discovered that survival wasn't enough. That sometimes you had to reach for impossibility, to bet everything on dreams that seemed too fragile to sustain, to trust that strength you didn't know you possessed would emerge when circumstances demanded it. She found Mia in the powered Cocoon room, her daughter's small face pressed against the glass of the main breeding chamber, watching butterflies move through their eternal cycles of transformation. When Mia sensed Sarah's presence, she turned with a smile that made everything worthwhile. "Mommy, look, 3 more emerged today. Dr. Morrison says their wing patterns are perfect." Sarah joined her daughter at the glass, both of them silent witnesses to metamorphosis that happened whether anyone watched or not. The butterflies moved with lazy grace, unaware that their silk would help surgeons repair children's hearts, that their existence validated 40 years of solitary dedication, that their beauty had become currency in the marketplace of medical miracles. "Uncle Vincent would be happy," Mia announced, with the certainty of childhood, and Sarah, looking at butterflies that shouldn't exist, silk that defied conventional science, a legacy built through obsession and faith and stubborn refusal to quit. Sarah had to agree. Vincent would be happy, not because his work had made them wealthy or famous or secure, but because Sarah had done what he'd hoped, accepted impossible inheritance, protected fragile transformation, and invited the world to witness miracle that one man had nurtured in darkness for 40 years, waiting for someone strong enough to carry it into light. The walls had been moving with butterflies, but what really moved were boundaries between possible and impossible, between burden and blessing, between inheritance accepted reluctantly and purpose embraced completely. Vincent had left her everything, and Sarah had transformed it into something even he couldn't have imagined. Not just survival, but legacy that would endure long after all of them were forgotten, written in silk, proteins that healed, in butterflies that symbolized metamorphosis, in the fundamental truth that sometimes the greatest treasures hide in places everyone else dismisses as worthless. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen. Now I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.